He barked at her to get back to the kitchen, because to him, a black woman in first class could only be staff. The room went silent, but no one stepped in. No one questioned it. She stood there, humiliated, every eye in the room slicing through her like she didn't belong. And in that moment, the message was clear: you're not one of us. But what they didn't know, what made this moment the beginning of their downfall, was that she wasn't just a passenger. She was the reason this company existed. The real power didn't walk in through the front door. It was already seated, already watching, already deciding who would be left standing. This isn't a story about anger. It's about exposure. About what happens when the people you underestimate flip the entire system from the inside out. You think you've seen justice? You haven't seen it from this angle. If that moment hit you, if you've ever been misjudged, silenced, or watched someone else get torn down for looking different, subscribe now. Drop a comment, tell us where you're watching from, and let us know. What would you have done if you were her? This is just the opening move. Jalen Brooks stood at the edge of the glass lobby, his polished Oxford shoes barely making a sound on the marble floor. It was 8:45 a.m. sharp, 15 minutes ahead of the scheduled executive interview, a meeting that could change his life. Dressed in a navy three-piece suit that hugged his athletic frame and with a manila folder tucked under one arm, Jalen moved with the calm precision of someone who had rehearsed every detail. Years of building a multi-layered AI security platform from scratch had trained him to be exacting. And yet, as he approached the elevator bay at HelixQuant's Manhattan headquarters, something felt off. A security guard, mid-50s, stocky, badge tilted sideways on a sweat-stained uniform, stepped in front of him just as the elevator dinged open. "Excuse me, sir," the man barked without looking up from his clipboard. "This entrance is for candidates only." Jalen blinked. "I am a candidate. Jalen Brooks, 8th floor, executive suite." He raised his voice a notch, hoping to slice through the noise and the undercurrent of condescension. The guard finally looked up. His gaze scanned Jalen, paused on the brown skin, the close-cropped hair, the tailored suit, then narrowed. "You sure you're not making a delivery or something?" His tone didn't accuse, it dismissed. Jalen forced a smile. "I built the system your team is trying to acquire. I assure you, I'm in the right place." The guard didn't respond, just buzzed his walkie. "Got a guy here. Says he's a founder. Doesn't look like it." Upstairs, inside the sprawling oak-paneled boardroom, Richard Carmichael leaned back in his ergonomic chair, legs crossed, a sleek espresso steaming beside him. At 54, Richard was the type of man who liked his world curated. His suits custom, his colleagues deferential, his ideas unchallenged. He had built HelixQuant into a billion-dollar predictive analytics company, and he'd done it his way. So when the name Jalen Brooks landed on his desk as a prospective acquisition partner, he scoffed. "Brooks," he said to the room, the corner of his mouth twitching upward. "Is that the diversity quota entry or the AI prodigy we keep hearing about?" A few awkward chuckles slipped out around the table. No one corrected him. Kara Linden, VP of Tech Strategy, cleared her throat. "He's the founder of Vortec, self-coded the real-time detection engine we flagged for acquisition last quarter." Richard waved a dismissive hand. "Ah yes, the wunderkind from South LA, right? The one the media keeps calling the next Elon just because he speaks in code and not slang." His voice was coated with sarcasm sharp enough to cut the tension hanging over the conference table. "Let's hope he doesn't expect us to roll out the red carpet. I'm not paying $200 million for optics." Downstairs, Jalen's phone buzzed. It was Kara. Her text was short. "You'll need to enter through the side. Lobby security's being stubborn." A slow breath escaped his lips. He took the service corridor to a less visible elevator, the one marked deliveries. It smelled of ammonia and ancient plastic. The kind of hallway that led places people like him weren't supposed to enter, except to fix, clean, or drop something off. But Jalen walked it anyway. Silently, calmly. Let them think what they want. At 9:05, he stepped into the boardroom. The room quieted. His presence didn't scream billionaire tech founder. He didn't have wild hair or futuristic glasses, or wear a hoodie like the Silicon Valley legends. He was deliberate, crisp, and sharp-edged, more like a strategist than a dreamer. Richard didn't stand to greet him. Just eyed Jalen with the same detachment a jeweler might reserve for a gemstone they weren't convinced was real. "Mr. Brooks," Richard said finally. "You're late." "Only by your expectations," Jalen replied coolly. "Not the clock." Kara's lips twitched at the comeback. A few others looked away, pretending to jot notes. Richard gestured toward the sleek, black chair at the head of the table, the one typically reserved for senior executives. "You can sit there, unless that's too presumptuous." Jalen didn't react. He took the seat slowly, meeting Richard's stare like he'd been doing it his whole life. He had. The air was colder now, not from the weather, but from the silent realization that the meeting had never been about acquisition. It had been a performance, a ritual meant to remind him of where they believed he belonged. Kara caught up with him near the curb, her tone hushed, urgent. "I'm sorry," she said, eyes scanning for listening ears. "I didn't know Richard was going to humiliate you like that." Jalen looked at her, one eyebrow raised. "You didn't know," he echoed, not accusing, just noting. "Or you didn't stop it." She flinched but didn't argue. "There's a mixer tonight. VC leaders, tech strategists, the same board members who sat in that room. You should come. Show them you're not backing down." He paused, calculating. He hated the idea of being seen as seeking validation, but this wasn't about validation. It was about planting seeds. So he nodded once and walked away. Hours later, Jalen stood at the center of a marble-lined reception hall in Midtown, its ceilings vaulted, its crowd curated. Suits and stemware filled the space like well-dressed static. He wore the same navy suit, now spotless after a steam press, and held a glass of still water, while the others floated between flutes of Veuve and meaningless introductions. Kara spotted him near the silent auction table and made her way over. "I got you added to the list last minute," she said quickly. "But heads up, Richard's here too." Jalen didn't flinch. Of course he is. Before he could move toward the circle of investors gathered near the ballroom doors, someone tapped him on the shoulder. A tall man in a white tuxedo jacket with a name badge reading, "Events Consultant Valmont," gestured impatiently toward a silver tray. "We need the dame brought out before they start the speech. Use the west service door." Jalen blinked. "Excuse me." The man frowned, clearly irritated. "This isn't complicated. Champagne. Front left. Move." Jalen said nothing for a long moment. His grip tightened slightly on the base of his glass. Then calmly he responded, "I'm not staff. I'm a keynote nominee." The man paled slightly, but before he could apologize or recover, another guest passed by and chuckled under his breath. "They're getting creative with the waiters this year." Jalen didn't react, just turned, eyes scanning for the one place in the room where he could recalibrate. Kara met him near the digital pitch wall. She had heard the exchange, but said nothing. Instead, she handed him a tablet. "You should know," she said quietly. "You weren't on the short list until I double-checked the system." Jalen's eyes narrowed. "Meaning?" She took a deep breath. "Someone flagged your file internally. HR saw a note, not culturally aligned." It was hidden in the metadata of the file upload, not in plain sight. Jalen's voice dropped, calm but seething. "Who added the note?" Kara hesitated, then tapped the corner of the screen. A name appeared. Bryce Teller, head of people operations. Close to Richard. Loyal. Jalen didn't respond immediately. Just nodded, filed it away, and closed the tablet. The rest of the evening passed in polite choreography. Jalen moved between conversations with angel investors and analysts, performing the delicate dance of composure while watching the silent engine of exclusion churn just beneath the surface. Twice, people asked him if he was with the AV crew. Once, someone handed him an empty flute. Each time he smiled, responded with perfect articulation, then walked away, not out of weakness, but because he was counting, storing, calculating. By the end of the evening, he stood alone by the East Terrace overlooking a skyline that had once inspired him. Behind him, Richard's laughter cut through the din of voices like static. The next morning arrived with the deceptive clarity of sunlight piercing a New York skyline, still recovering from last night's storm. Jalen sat alone in his loft apartment overlooking the East River, the filtered light cutting sharp lines across the open concrete floor. The night's events still played in his mind, not like memories, but like chess pieces, waiting to be arranged. He opened his laptop, intent on reviewing market movements and recalibrating Vorteca's upcoming series, See Outreach. But his inbox had already begun to rot. The first email bore the subject line forward, concerning background flags on candidate Brooks. The message was terse, buried inside a forward chain of internal chatter from Helix Quant's senior recruitment board. At the bottom, a single phrase stood out, highlighted by a partner associate. Can we confirm this Jalen Brooks identity matches legal filings? One of my guys says there's no incorporation under his name in the Delaware registry. Jalen frowned. He leaned back in his chair, puzzled. His incorporation had been airtight. Vortec was real. Its patents, provisional filings, even payroll structures were certified and digital. His name was stamped across them all. But whoever this guy was, he'd crafted it out. A seed meant not to prove anything, only to suggest everything could be false. Minutes later, another notification arrived, this time from a former colleague at a competing firm. Bro, check this. Richard's people are circulating this video in internal chats. Jalen clicked the attachment. The video was grainy, surveillance style, shot from a corner angle of the Helix boardroom. It showed Jalen during yesterday's meeting, arms moving, voice raised, his words cut in mid-sentence, edited, slanted, framed to make him look unhinged. The audio had been doctored, with slight static timed to mask Richard's provocations, while enhancing Jalen's sharper phrases. The video was just long enough to reinforce every stereotype that had ever been used to silence someone who looked like him. Emotional, erratic, aggressive. But Jalen remembered that meeting well. He hadn't raised his voice once. He had spoken with deliberate restraint. The real footage would show a man in control. This was a lie. He reached out to Kara immediately. Her voice came through on the third ring, groggy but alert. "They're accelerating the smear," he said without greeting. Kara sighed. "I know. I warned you. Richard's people don't destroy ideas. They destroy perception. They're saying I'm not the founder," Jalen continued, "that my filings are fake, and they're cutting boardroom footage to make me look like a threat." Kara exhaled. "It's Bryce. He has access to internal IT servers, HR systems, video feeds. He's done this before to whistleblowers, to execs he couldn't silence." Jalen was silent for a moment. Then, how do I fight something that was designed to feel true, even when it's fake? Kara paused. With something more dangerous than lies. Like what? Proof, she said. And timing. Jalen stood and crossed the window, staring out at the quiet swirl of water below. The stakes weren't just reputational anymore, they were existential. He was 2 weeks away from finalizing a deal to acquire Helix Quant outright through a silent investment firm he'd structured in stealth mode for months. He hadn't intended to reveal that. Not yet. But now, the smear campaign was too precise to be coincidence. Someone had dug too deep. They were scared. That gave him leverage. By midday, the rumors spread like accelerant. Tech blogs began receiving anonymous tips about inconsistencies in Jalen's LinkedIn credentials. A whisper campaign emerged claiming his MIT record had been overstated. Some LinkedIn connections quietly unlisted him. One VC group postponed a scheduled meeting without explanation. Meanwhile, the doctored video leaked into a closed Slack group populated by startup insiders, where it spread like wildfire. Rebranded with sarcastic titles like Founder Age, Billion-Dollar Meltdown. The comments were vicious. Another fake genius. I've seen this before. Overcompensating. Bet he thinks he's the next Elon, too. But it was a call from Kara late that evening that stripped away the last remaining layer of pretense. She sounded breathless, like she had just walked out of a fire. "They're done hiding it, Jay," she said, no longer bothering with subtlety. "I was just in the compliance room." Bryce didn't even lower his voice. Jalen, sitting in the dim glow of his monitor, didn't need to ask what she meant. Still, he said, "What did he say?" Her answer landed like ice across his chest. He told the chief risk officer, "We'll bury him in red tape before we ever let someone like that run anything here. He can code, sure, but lead? Not in this company. Not in this image." The word image hung in the air like smoke. Jalen let the silence stretch before responding. "Record everything. Dates, names, locations. Don't intervene. Just document." By the next morning, Jalen was already moving. The team at Tel Aviv had confirmed the video tampering. They found digital fingerprints embedded in the compression layers, timing mismatches, and artificial pitch adjustments in the audio. He'd have a full report by Monday, legal grade, media ready. But even with that ammunition in hand, he knew this was bigger than a defamation case. This was about exposing something deeper. So when Kara texted him that Richard was scheduled to speak at the closed-door Helix advisory lunch at the Rothwood Club, Jalen didn't hesitate. He booked a table at the restaurant next door, just 3 feet from the private event room's frosted glass divider. The kind that didn't block sound if you sat close enough. He didn't have to wait long. Less than 15 minutes into the luncheon, Richard's voice filtered through the thin partition. Casual, confident, unaware. "We've had our fair share of startup dreamers walk in here," he said, laughter bubbling in the background. "But this one's different. Dangerous even." A pause. Someone, likely a board member, asked, "Dangerous how?" Richard didn't flinch. "Because he's not looking to be bought. He's looking to own. I've seen the filings. He's circling with a holding firm, probably a shell. He wants control. And I'll be damned if I let some tech savant with a chip on his shoulder rewrite the architecture of this company." Then, the sentence Jalen would never forget, "I don't care how smart he is. I'm not letting that kid touch a single share of Helix Quant. Not on my watch." Jalen leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He finished his espresso in silence, then stood, leaving a single folded receipt on the table. On it, he had scribbled one word: documented. The following day, Jalen met with a journalist from a Ledger, a respected investigative publication known for exposing institutional corruption. He didn't give them the full story. Not yet. But he handed over the audio from Rothwood, authenticated timestamps, and the metadata report from the Tel Aviv team. "More's coming," he said, slipping a sealed envelope across the table. "You'll want to be ready for it." The journalist, a woman named Lee Norwood, nodded without asking questions. She had the instincts of someone who knew exactly how to read silence. But Jalen's biggest revelation came not from reporters or tech allies, but from inside Helix itself. A young HR analyst named Simon reached out anonymously through an encrypted thread. His message was short but seismic. "Check your applicant ID in the back end. I think you've been on the blacklist since day one." Jalen logged in through an archived link Kara had once given him. The data he found was chilling. His candidate file had a hidden flag, a non-visible marker assigned only to internal admin view. The code read, "NCE Class 5, not culturally eligible. Do not advance to executive." He ran the script again to verify. It returned the same result. Weeks earlier, his product had been chosen as one of only 6 to be showcased live on stage in front of a full investor panel, hundreds of industry leaders, and 3 international tech correspondents. But now, as he glanced at the finalized schedule posted outside the production tent, his name was nowhere to be found. The segment still read, "Vortex Systems Demonstration of Predictive Defense Framework." The product was there. The company was there. But the person who had conceived, engineered, and delivered it? Erased. Jalen's chest tightened, but he didn't leave. He approached the event coordinator, a brisk woman in a headset named Deirdre, and calmly asked, "I don't see my name on the presenter list." She scanned him quickly, then flipped her clipboard. "Name: Jalen Brooks, founder." A pause. A flicker of discomfort. "You'll need to check with Richard Carmichael's team," she said, voice curt. "They've submitted the updated lineup." All co-founders and product leads had to be pre-approved through Helix Quant's acquisition channel. Jalen's gaze sharpened. "I never ceded control of Vortec. "We haven't signed anything." Deirdre didn't answer. She simply turned and walked off, headset crackling as she disappeared into the crowd. Jalen's phone buzzed a moment later. It was Kara. The message was a single line. "They pulled your founder credentials from the submission packet." Richard ordered it. The words hit like a gut punch. Not only had Richard scrubbed his name from the platform he built, he'd done so days before their official acquisition agreement was to be signed, knowing Jalen had yet to execute the final sale. But they didn't care. Not about legality. Not about decency. Only about erasure. Still, Jalen refused to be passive. As the presentation began, he moved to the wings of the stage, silent, composed, waiting for his moment. The demo team, 2 Helix Quant engineers who had never even seen the source code until 3 weeks ago, fumbled their way through the technical breakdown, mispronouncing algorithm functions and misrepresenting risk metrics. The lead investor from Promethean Capital frowned. The second panelist, a tech journalist from Geneva, whispered something to her colleague. Jalen felt his jaw tighten. He couldn't watch them butcher years of work. So he stepped forward. Halfway through the Q&A, he walked calmly to the edge of the stage and addressed the panel directly. "If I may," he said, his voice carrying, "there's a correction that needs to be made. I built the core engine you just saw. The anomaly recognition layer wasn't reverse engineered. It's native to our architecture. The team presenting wasn't involved in that design." Gasps rose from the audience. A few phones lifted, already filming. The lead engineer on stage looked like he might melt into the floor. But before the panel could respond, Deirdre stormed from the side. "I'm sorry," she said through gritted teeth, grabbing Jalen's arm. "You're not authorized to be on this stage." Jalen didn't resist. He simply looked her in the eyes and said, "Tell them why." Security approached. 2 guards in suits, already briefed. "Sir, we'll need you to step down." "On what grounds?" Jalen asked. "This is my IP, my platform." One of the guards hesitated. "Sir, we were told you're not part of the official presenter list." Behind them, Richard emerged, calm as ever, flanked by Bryce and a VC from Vellum Partners. "Let it go," Richard called smoothly. "He's just looking for a moment." Jalen was escorted down as cameras flashed. Not all looked away in shame. Some leaned forward, intrigued, as if this were performance art. But Kara, watching from the press box, was pale with fury. Her fingers trembled as she sent Jalen a new screenshot, a redacted internal Slack message from Bryce sent just hours before the demo. It read, "Delete all references to Brooks from Cap Table Light. He's not critical. Brand optics are cleaner without him." For every voice that defended him, another questioned why he was so emotional, why he couldn't just wait his turn, why he had to make a scene. But it wasn't a scene, it was survival. Still, perception had its own gravity, and Richard had been banking on it. The goal hadn't been to silence Jalen in the room. It was to stain him beyond it. Back at his apartment, Jalen scrolled through the night's mentions with clinical detachment. He wasn't looking for sympathy. He was looking for cracks, patterns in the chaos. Then, just after midnight, Kara sent him a file-flagged confidential escalation chain. It was a forward from a whistleblower inside Helix Quant's comms department. The original sender, Bryce. The subject line, controlling narrative. Jalen Brooks equals controlled variable. The body of the email was worse than the title. It read, "Use him as our PR buffer. Let the media frame him as the underdog. Build sympathy for our acquisition strategy. We keep him quiet, visible, but irrelevant. It plays well on panels. Ticks DI boxes. If he resists, we reframe it as insecurity. Keep the mic small, keep the message clean." At the bottom, someone had replied with a laughing emoji and the words, "Damn, he really thinks he's one of us." Jalen stared at the screen, his hands curling into fists. So that's what he had been to them. Not a partner, not a threat, not even a competitor, just a narrative device, a human headline, a pawn they could hold up for applause, then hide away when the real decisions were made. He closed the file slowly, resisting the primal urge to hurl the laptop across the room. No, he wouldn't give them that release. He would give them something colder, sharper, permanent. But the damage didn't stop there. 2 days later, during a scheduled call with Nova Group, a key player in the Series C round, Jalen was met not with optimism, but with a pivot. The senior strategist on the line, a man named Lior Feldstein, spoke carefully, too carefully. "We've reevaluated alignment optics," he said. "Your trajectory is compelling, but some of our European partners feel your media presence right now is, how to say it, distracting." Jalen didn't blink. "You mean the video?" he said. Lior hesitated. "Among other things. Some members feel that the leadership energy doesn't quite align with the global executive tone we're targeting. It's not a matter of capability. It's perception, optics." Jalen sat silently for a long beat. Then he said, voice low, "Would you say the same to a white founder who was ambushed and removed from his own product stage?" Lior paused. "This isn't about race, Mr. Brooks." "No," Jalen replied. "It's about comfort. And I'm not your version of comfortable." The line went dead soon after. Another door shut without sound. The following morning, a journalist from Techlist contacted Jalen. She wanted to run a profile, the real face of the future of AI, but under one condition. He had to talk about the Helix incident. All of it. Jalen considered it briefly, then declined. "The story's not done yet," he told her. "And I'm not here to bleed. I'm here to break something open." She understood, barely. By nightfall, even Kara began to sound defeated. "They've gotten to the board of InnovationNet," she whispered. "You were top billed for the International Tech Leadership Summit. They just pulled you from a panel. No explanation. Just gone." Jalen stood in silence, looking out over the Hudson, the water glinting like armor in the dark. "Let them pull me," he said. A printed agreement sat inside a leather folder at the center of the long black table. Champagne waited on ice. PR reps loitered nearby, ready to capture Richard Carmichael's moment of conquest. Jalen, seated at the far end of the room, said nothing as lawyers buzzed around him. His posture was steady, his suit crisp, his gaze unreadable. But there was a cold gravity to him now, something that pulled the room taut without force or sound. Kara sat beside him, expression unreadable. Bryce whispered something into Richard's ear at the other end, drawing a chuckle that sounded more like a prelude to war. Richard leaned back and fixed Jalen with a confident smirk. "I'll give you this," he said loud enough for the room to hear. "You've been one hell of a story." Jalen met his eyes, but didn't respond. Not yet. A vibration ticked against the table. Jalen's phone lit up. Unknown number. He answered without excuse, one finger raised slightly to silence the murmuring around him. "Yes," he said into the line, voice calm. A pause. Then a faint smile touched his lips. "Perfect. Go ahead." He ended the call and placed the phone face down in front of him. Across the table, Richard narrowed his eyes. "Is there a problem?" Jalen shook his head once. "Not at all. In fact, this is the part I've been looking forward to." He leaned forward, voice cutting cleanly through the still air. "You remember Arcadia Holdings?" Richard blinked, caught off guard. "The equity group from Singapore?" "No," Jalen replied. "The parent company that's been quietly acquiring your key patents for the last 6 months." Another pause. "The one that submitted the acquisition offer for Helix Quant." The room stilled. Richard's smile faltered. Jalen continued, his tone even surgical. "I founded Arcadia Holdings under a legal trust. Kara managed its blind filings. You didn't just try to erase the founder of the platform you coveted. You tried to white label him, bury him, and steal his seat at the table." He paused, letting the weight of his words land. "Unfortunately for you, the table belongs to me." Richard's face drained of color. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "This is a bluff. No one has that kind of capital except..." He stopped mid-sentence as Kara reached into her bag and pulled out a slim black folder, sliding it across the table. Jalen opened it slowly, revealing ownership papers, shell transfer confirmations, and SEC-verified filings. Every signature, every transaction, every proof. Then he turned to the room, to the lawyers, to the board members who had smiled in his face while planning his erasure. "Effective immediately," he said. "Arcadia Holdings is withdrawing its acquisition offer. This company no longer aligns with our ethical investment standards." The lawyer seated at Jalen's left reached into his briefcase and handed a single-page letter to Richard. "Formal notice," the man said. "Your valuation is now under independent review. All pending investment conversations will be paused until the findings of the review are disclosed publicly." Richard stood, his voice rising. "You think you can tank us with a stunt?" Jalen rose with him, gaze level. "You tanked yourselves when you built your value on the backs of people you never intended to share it with." The words struck harder than shouting could have. Bryce looked pale. One board member stood up and quietly exited the room. 2 others followed. Kara stood too, placing her badge on the table. "I'd resign, Richard, before the news breaks." Richard turned toward the window, trying to collect his breath, but Jalen had already stepped out the door. 2 hours later, headlines exploded. Helix Quant acquisition canceled after covert ownership scandal. Anonymous equity firm revealed to be startup founder ousted by target company. Arcadia Holdings pulls plug on $840 million deal. Ethical breach cited. Every headline carried the same revelation in some variation. Jalen Brooks unmasked as Arcadia CEO in bold power move against Helix Quant. Tech prodigy turns the table on industry giant. Helix deal implodes. But what stunned readers even more wasn't just the identity behind Arcadia Holdings. It was the truth behind its creation. In an exclusive piece published by The Ledger, investigative journalist Lee Norwood confirmed what no one had seen coming. Jalen had designed Arcadia not only as an investment entity, but as a proving ground. For over a year, he had been secretly vetting acquisition targets, not just on their technology, but on their culture, ethics, and how they treated people who didn't look like them. The article included a quote from Jalen himself. "I didn't want to own broken systems. I wanted to see who broke them first." The backlash was instant and seismic. Analysts on financial morning shows could barely keep up with the plummeting valuation graphs. Richard Carmichael, once praised as a visionary, was now under fire for overseeing a company whose internal culture had, through one deliberate act after another, demonstrated systemic bias. But it wasn't until midday that the story turned from financial scandal to moral reckoning. A whistleblower inside Helix Quant leaked a folder to Lee Norwood titled, "Internal Behavior Reports Flagged but Ignored." The documents included email chains, Slack messages, and most damning of all, hidden camera footage from internal HR training modules and executive sessions. One clip showed Bryce Teller laughing with another director, saying, "Jalen's good optics, not good leadership. He's what we put on the front page, not behind the door." Another showed Richard himself in a strategy call, stating coldly, "We need someone with a boardroom look, not just talent, presence, authority. You know what I mean?" When asked to clarify, he smiled and said, "Let's just say I don't want to have to explain our diversity initiatives with a photo. We're not that kind of brand." The footage spread like wildfire. Within hours, the hashtag not that kind of brand trended globally. Tech forums, diversity think tanks, and mainstream news anchors weighed in. Suddenly, Helix Quant was not just a company under scrutiny. It was a cautionary tale. And Jalen? He was no longer just the man behind the reveal. He had become a symbol of a new kind of leadership, a quiet disruptor who didn't ask for inclusion. He designed the system to test whether people deserved it. Meanwhile, Jalen stayed off camera. He didn't tweet. He didn't post. He let the story tell itself. Kara fielded interview requests, most of which they declined. "It's not time for a TED Talk," she told one executive producer. "It's time for them to sit with what they ignored." Still, behind the scenes, Jalen was already moving. He called a closed-door roundtable with 3 other underrepresented founders and 2 international AI ethicists. His goal wasn't vengeance, it was re-engineering capital pipelines. "We don't need seats at their table," he said quietly. "We need to build one they can't afford to be left out of." By the end of the week, Richard Carmichael's name had been stripped from every public-facing partnership. The Helix board issued a statement announcing his voluntary departure. Bryce had disappeared from LinkedIn entirely, and while PR firms scrambled to repair the firm's image, investors withdrew in droves. The company that once positioned itself as the future of predictive technology was now fighting to stay solvent. But the most poetic moment came not in a headline or a court ruling. It came in a live stream from a college Jalen had once spoken at, where a young black engineering student was asked who her biggest inspiration was. She smiled, held up a phone with Jalen's face on the screen, and said, "The guy who didn't scream when they tried to erase him. He built a better system instead." Outside, reporters clustered like vultures behind barricades, flashes firing at every flicker behind the tinted glass. Hours later, a terse press release was issued to global media. Effective immediately, Richard Carmichael has been relieved of his duties as Chief Executive Officer of Helix Quant Technologies. Additional terminations include Bryce Teller, Chief People Officer, Marcy Hewitt, Head of Corporate Image, and 3 members of the Executive Strategy Team. The board has appointed interim leadership and will initiate a full cultural audit. The fallout was instant. Helix stock dropped another 17% before the market closed, wiping nearly $400 million off its paper valuation. Their flagship partners, Nova Group, VectorPoint, and Vellum, severed ties within 48 hours, citing incompatibility with evolving values. Every name linked to the suppression of Jalen Brooks' identity became a liability. Every signature on the flagged internal memos became target. Richard, once the towering figure whose decisions steered entire market waves, was now hounded by paparazzi outside his Tribeca condo. In a leaked internal message to a friend, he wrote, "I didn't lose a deal. I lost the world's respect." But the consequences didn't end with reputation. Lawsuits began filing in. 2 former employees who had been quietly dismissed for raising similar concerns about bias now stepped into the spotlight, backed by advocacy firms and civil rights attorneys. One tech publication dubbed it the Great Unmasking, a moment the industry would refer to for years as the tipping point where silence stopped being profitable. Meanwhile, Jalen watched it all unfold with the discipline of a man who had already calculated every step. His phone rang hourly with new offers, televised interviews, keynote requests, investment invitations. But none of them interested him. What did arrive, however, was a letter from the newly restructured Helix board, requesting a formal meeting. Kara read it aloud as they sat in Jalen's penthouse loft, sunlight bleeding across the marble floor. "They want to bring you in as strategic advisor," she said, voice flat. "Help rebuild the company from the inside out. Full authority. Name your terms." Jalen didn't even look up from the legal brief he was annotating. "Why would I help rebuild what they tried to bury me beneath?" Kara paused, then said quietly, "Because now they know the cost of that mistake." He considered that, but his answer didn't change. The next day, he drafted a public response and posted it across every major platform. It read, "I respectfully declined the advisory position at Helix Quant. True change cannot be patched from the inside if the walls were built to keep people like me out. Instead, I will be launching the Equitable Futures Fund, a $100 million venture initiative seeded with private capital, to invest in Black and brown founders building systems, not begging for access. We will not chase seats at broken tables. We will build new institutions, transparent, inclusive, and impossible to silence." The announcement sent shockwaves across Silicon Valley and beyond. Within 48 hours, the Equitable Futures Fund had received pledges from 3 major banks, 5 angel syndicates, and an anonymous Fortune 500 CEO. It wasn't just momentum, it was a movement. And for the first time in years, headlines weren't praising innovation for its profit. They were praising it for its purpose. In a rare statement, one of Helix Quant's remaining board members said, "What Jalen Brooks did wasn't sabotage. It was a mirror, and we didn't like what we saw in it." The industry began to fracture along a new fault line, not just between legacy and disruption, but between those who built to protect power and those who built to share it. 1 year later, the air inside the Global Equity in Tech Forum shimmered with a calm kind of anticipation. The event, hosted in the newly constructed Athena Civic Center in San Francisco, wasn't just another conference. It had become a milestone, an annual reckoning, a gathering where visionaries came not to celebrate what they had built, but to confront what they had ignored. The room held a different silence than the ones Jalen had once been forced to endure. This one was expectant, charged with the possibility of transformation, not oppression. At the center stage, surrounded by delegates, founders, educators, and policymakers from 5 continents, Jalen stood in a charcoal gray suit, no tie, hands folded as he waited for the final speaker to be introduced. The moderator cleared her throat and stepped up to the mic. "Our closing address today," she said, with only the barest tremor in her voice, "comes from a man who, until recently, was the face of what this movement stood against. His fall was public, but what he's done since then has remained private. Until now." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Then she said his name. "Please welcome Richard Carmichael." There was no applause at first, just a long, loaded pause as the audience collectively processed the moment. Then, slowly, the room acknowledged what it meant for him to be there. Richard walked to the podium in a simple navy blazer, no branding, no entourage. He looked older, not in years, but in weight. His voice, when it came, was quieter than anyone remembered. "I used to think I was the center of the room," he began. "I used to think that if you built enough, bought enough, proved enough, you earned the right to ignore what made you uncomfortable." He paused, letting the words hang there like a confession. "But then I met a man who didn't shout, who didn't sue, who didn't burn it all down, though he could have. Instead, he showed me what power looks like when it isn't afraid to listen. Jalen Brooks didn't ruin me. He revealed me. And for the first time, I saw myself as others had been forced to see me." The room was silent. No one fidgeted. No one checked their phones. Richard continued, "I lost everything that made me powerful. But I gained something I didn't know I needed, clarity. So I came here today not to reclaim anything, but to return something I took. My presence, my silence, my resistance. I offer them back to the communities I once excluded. And I ask not for absolution, but for accountability." He stepped back, nodded once, and began to leave the stage, until Jalen stepped forward. The 2 men met center stage in front of the world, eyes locked not in battle, but in recognition. There were no words exchanged at first, just a handshake, firm, deliberate, undeniable. The audience rose to their feet, not in celebration of victory or surrender, but in acknowledgement of something deeper, the possibility of change. Afterward, Jalen addressed the crowd one last time. "Justice isn't always loud," he said. "Sometimes it's a quiet shift in a room you never thought would welcome you. Sometimes it's watching the very hands that tried to shut you out open a door instead." His eyes scanned the room. Change doesn't begin when people fall. It begins when they rise for something more than themselves. Weeks later, a new initiative launched, co-chaired by Jalen and Richard. The Horizon Accord, a multi-sector tech ethics coalition that pledged not only transparency, but reparative structure, funding, mentorship, and oversight for historically excluded entrepreneurs. Their first act, an equity index built from Jalen's original Vortec algorithms, now open-sourced and governed by an international ethics board. It was the most public act of accountability the industry had ever seen. But behind closed doors, what mattered more was the way Richard now listened, the way he deferred, the way he asked, not ordered. He had lost his company, but he had reclaimed something else, the will to be better. In the end, Jalen didn't need revenge. He didn't need applause. He had built something greater than a billion-dollar product. He had built the conditions for truth to echo where silence once ruled. And for the first time, the world didn't look away. The end. If this story moved you, consider subscribing for more powerful narratives where justice finds its voice. What moment hit you the hardest? Was it Jalen's quiet reveal or Richard's public reckoning? Let us know in the comments. And tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We'd love to hear your thoughts.